think we have to recognize and admit that many of us who are leaders in the North American church, by position quite often, I think we have to admit that many of us have never been strategically, intentionally discipled. And that many of us have had to figure out how to walk with Christ the hard way on our own, trying to pick ourselves up when we fall. And now what's happening is while we recognize we need to make disciples, we're equally trying to figure that out on the fly because we've never experienced it ourselves.
Hello, folks. Welcome to the Disciple Dilemma. I'm Dennis Allen, along with my co-host, Dr. Raymond Monroe. And today we want to talk about discipleship. It has obstacles. Our special guest is Dr. Chuck Lawless, who is the professor of Evangelism and Missions at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. So he thinks a lot about discipleship. He's also the Dean of Doctoral Studies and has some significant leadership roles with the International Mission Board. Chuck has written a paper called The 11 Obstacles to Effective Discipleship in the Church, along with a free ebook, which if you watch the episode, you can see the address to go get this free ebook called Bubbles, something that Chuck will explain to us in the course of discussion and how it affects disciples and leaders of disciples. So let's tune in with Raymond as we talk to Dr. Chuck Lawless from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary about the obstacles facing discipleship in the church today. Well, everyone, here I've done it again. I'm trapped between two PhDs, one a chemical engineer from Worcester Poly, and the other one from Southern Seminary, now teaching at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. So, Professor Chuck Lawless, we are so excited to have you with us today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to be with you today.
And Raymond, as always, thank you for raising the intellectual level of the conversation.
Yeah, you did, I thought, move from Auburn to Alabama and raise the standards in both places.
And if anyone's interested in applying for the job of co-host, please email me on the website.
Chuck, one of the biggest challenges that I see in the church is everybody talks about discipleship. No one defines what they're trying to do. What do you think a disciple is?
Yeah, it's a great question. The term itself means a student, but we're talking about disciples of Jesus here,
Sure.
Living out the Christian life as God is conforming us to the image of his Son. And so one of the things that I really want us to think about is the very question that you're raising, that we have a tendency in our churches to focus on the people in the community that we want to reach, the person that Rick Warren called Saddleback Sam years ago. And I think that's right, that we have to be focused on who are those folks that we're trying to get into the church to hear the gospel, that they might follow Christ. But our task is not done then. I think we have to think through the process of teaching people to obey everything that Jesus commanded. And we have to ask the question then, if Saddleback Sam is the person out in the community we're trying to reach, who is the person that I call Disciple Dave, who helps us to figure out this is what we want you to become under the scriptures. And so I generally summarize a disciple as someone who lives out the great commandments of Matthew 22, the Great Commission of Matthew 28. So we're loving God with all of our being, loving our neighbor as ourselves, doing the work of making disciples among all the peoples of the world. Somebody that is giving evidence of the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5, someone who's wearing the full armor of God in Ephesians 6, and someone who simply obeys Jesus. And so I think what we have to recognize is this process is never finished. We are from the moment God makes us his child. In fact, I would argue from the moment we begin to hear the gospel, somebody is in the process of helping us become a disciple of Christ. And that process continues until the Lord calls us home.
So do you think the movement from small groups to life groups is a positive way of articulating that discipleship means making lifelong friends to share together?
Yeah, I think it depends in some cases on how you define the terms. There are churches that use small group and life group interchangeably. But I do think that part of discipleship is that we are to do this life on life. There is no sense for me of Lone Ranger discipleship. I go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, where God says of Adam, it is not good for the man to be alone. And that's a pre-fall condition. God made him in such a way that it was not good for him to be alone. I don't think that was because God intends everybody to be married. That clearly there are those who are called to be single. There are those who are single that God uses. But I do think that's a mandate that says God created us in such a way that we need him. And out of that need, we also need one another, because it's in the context of relationships that we have accountability, that we experience God's love, that we learn from one another. And so anything we do that moves our discipleship beyond just information transfer. And the information transfer is helpful and necessary. We need to know the truth of God's word. But it's in the context of relationships that we move that information transfer into application in our lives so that we give evidence of our being conformed to the image of Christ. We have lowered a sense of disciple to anybody who is participating in the events of the church. And the way I describe it is we've determined that discipleship is you come to everything that we offer, and somehow you're going to put all the puzzle pieces together, and you're going to come out on the other end of that, a disciple living like Christ, modeling Christ's love. And we're assuming that people can take all the puzzle pieces and put the puzzle pieces together on their own. And that's simply not working. And I think we see the evidence of that in a church that may claim to have people who are following Jesus as his disciples, and yet they live like the world lives, and they tend not to love him or love God or love one another.
Yeah, as a seminary professor, let me push a little bit on that. How much of that is really sort of the rationalism we have, where we're teaching people sort of aphorisms, Bible propositions?
Yeah, I do think, and clearly I would stand on, we have a faith that is a propositional faith, that we do have teachings of the word that we live on. But I would also argue that one of the places we fail in the local churches is we have a tendency to teach the truth and not help our folks figure out how to apply that. It is for me even the weakest part of most expositional preaching today, is we can give the information, we can exposit the text, but we fail to take our listeners to, all right, this is the truth. Here's where that truth intersects with our lives. And here's how my life ought to look different on Monday because of what I've heard from the word on Sunday.
Great Commission is I'm supposed to be baptized, which means I take the name of Christ in everything I do. Every aspect of my life is supposed to be part of my disciple life. How did we miss that? And how do we regain that?
Yeah, we're to love God with all of our heart, soul, our mind, our body, with all of our being. I do think probably in American culture in particular, our tendency to be individualistic and atomistic, we tend to separate ourselves into our personal space, and we link arms only when we have to, not because we recognize that that's a part of what it means to be Christian. I think we probably have so moved toward individualism that we don't recognize the need for this community. We don't recognize the need for living life on life. And consequently, our faith becomes, I just attend rather than I live out my faith.
Folks, we are talking with Professor Chuck Lawless, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Chuck chairs Evangelism and Missions at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's overseeing a lot of doctoral program work there also, and has some significant connections with the International Mission Board. There's also, and you're seeing this on the screen right now, his ebook, which is out about bubbles. And if you don't understand what he's talking about with bubbles, you need to get that book and take a look at it. Secondly, you're also seeing now his article, 11 Obstacles to Effective Discipleship in the Church, which you're already hearing Raymond and Chuck conversing a little bit about, which we'll probe in a minute. Let me start out by first of all saying, I am very impressed, Raymond, that you could pack Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God in the same sentence with the Eagles' Dust in the Wind. That was very impressive. And as we kind of push that forward, speaking of the fear of being dust in the wind, Professor Lawless, I've got to tell you something as a Pew member, and I need your help here, right? Because as a theologian, you can help us unpack this problem. My greatest fear, according to Barna and Pew and the International Center for Research Studies, is that 9 out of 10 people sitting in the pews are going, A, I am completely afraid of sharing my faith. B, I'm completely unequipped to share my faith. C, it's your job, Professor and Pastor Chuck, to do that, not my job. So my question to you is this: are you trying to sell the story that every single one of us is an evangelist? How will you answer? And remember, you are under oath.
Yeah, here's what I would argue. We are all mandated to make disciples of the peoples of the world. That would be our neighbors, to the nations. And that's the responsibility of every believer. I don't see anything in the scriptures. 5 times Jesus gives us some expression of the Great Commission. I don't see anything that limits that task for those of us who are called to full-time ministry, serving in a pastoral or professorial role.
Yeah, let me push back just a second.
Yeah.
Ephesians text says there's some evangelists, some teachers, some other things. It doesn't say we're all evangelists. So how would you make a distinction between somebody who's an evangelist and the general call for all of us to share our faith?
Yeah, I think there are some who have some unique sense of ability to naturally move into the conversation, and in some cases are uniquely equipped to draw the net in different ways. But I don't think that sense lessens any of our responsibility to do the work of making disciples. That's a task that we're to teach to all believers. We make disciples, and then we teach them to obey everything Jesus commanded. That includes making disciples. And that sense of making disciples, as I look at Matthew 28, it's not just what takes place when someone becomes a believer.
So if the characteristic of a disciple is to love one another, it seems to me the end of discipleship is loving our neighbor, not evangelism. But evangelism is a key aspect of loving my neighbor if they're not a Christian.
No, absolutely. And I would argue that as we're making disciples, we are instruments of God in his process of conforming all of us to the image of Christ. And so I would push beyond just the end is to love one another. I would argue the end is we are becoming more and more conformed to the image of Christ. And the natural result of that is we're going to love as he loves.
So I need these 2 PhDs to sync up on something, right? I'm in the pew and I'm scared to death. So Chuck, what I need you to tell me is, and all you have to do is just say, you're absolutely right, Dennis, and everything will be fine. All I want you to say is, you don't all have to be evangelists.
Yeah, I'm not going to go there, because for me, it depends on how you're defining I would define evangelist as the person who speaks the good news. And are there those that are better at that or gifted at that? No question. But I would argue that every single one of us is responsible to proclaim the good news of Jesus. And that means we are announcing the good news. That makes us those who tell the good news. That makes us evangelists at that point. And so my fear is that somehow we will relegate this task of telling people about Christ to only those people who are either professionally trained to do that, or that claim a gift that others may not have.
How do we get out of this sort of semantical problem that when I talk about sin and forgiveness and those things, I'm using language that it really isn't common today?
And even inside the church, I think we're assuming that those who attend every Sunday can define the terms, they understand the terms, they understand what we believe and why we believe it. I
Sure.
think we have to do a much better job of backing up to say, let's go back and start at square one, and let's make sure we're defining terms, we're discussing terms in helping people understand the truth of the gospel. And a God who died for us while we were yet sinners, and is still calling people to himself.
Folks, we're talking with Professor Chuck Lawless, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's the chair of Evangelism and Missions at SEBTS, and what a terrific conversation we're having. And when we come back, Raymond's going to start probing a little more of the motivation behind, as well as the context of Chuck's paper, 11 Obstacles, which is a really fascinating conversation on discipleship. So take a look at the symbols up on the screen right now about the Bubble ebook that Chuck's giving away on his website, as well as 11 Obstacles. Fascinating article. Chuck, if I had only known you had written that, I could have gotten completely out of having to write that book. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back.
How do you try to get past this bubble phenomena within churches today? How do pastors get out of it? How do churches get out of it?
Well, it's tough. And by bubble, what I'm talking about is we get cocooned among other believers. And so we don't even know any non-believers with whom we can share the gospel. We don't have relationships with folks because our whole world is wrapped up in the context of hanging out with other believers. And it's tough in a seminary setting, because particularly for students who come to the campus, in some ways, we're pulling them into the bubble a little bit.
Sure.
And so I think what we have to do as professors is one, make sure that we're helping our students understand the reality and the danger of the bubble, and then work with them to figure out, all right, while you're under our training, how do we help you get off this campus, get to know people who need to know Jesus? How can we help you walk beside other people to answer the questions that they may raise in honest conversations, but figuring out how to do that in cooperation with a local church, which is ideally the way we would do it in the seminaries. Sure. The local church is doing that. Pastors are modeling that. We just come alongside them to help them do that. That's what we ought to be doing. It's just not easy to do. Let me add one thought to that. I
Sure.
do think this is one of the places where, and I recognize not every seminary professor agrees with me here, and you may differ with me, but this is one of the places where I think online education, theological education, can be helpful for some students, particularly that student who is being discipled by a godly leader in a healthier church. And that student is learning how to get to know people who believe differently. He or she is intentionally investing in the lives of non-believers, and there are other believers walking with him or her to do that well. And then we get to help educate them, not by extracting them from their place where they're being discipled, but by getting education to them via online. I think there can be real value in that.
Dennis, you're doing great. I was going to dump on you anyway, because in business, you face the same thing with dysfunctional organizations. I
find it's really an interesting problem that you bring up there, Raymond, and I wanted to ask Chuck about this at some point. When I go speak at business schools, what I find is a lot of students who gain a tremendous amount of technical knowledge, financial engineering, market dynamics, how you evaluate people, how you build really cool spreadsheets. But what I don't find in the business schools, I don't think I'm finding in seminaries. And the reason I suspect what I'm about to tell you is not in seminaries is that I'm getting calls from discipleship pastors saying, I don't know how to do discipleship. Mm-hmm. I am wondering, in this conversation, guys, business schools don't teach people how to do organizational dynamics. They don't teach leaders how to lead in organizations. And I wonder if the seminaries spend a lot of time building technical, powerful wonderful pastors. This is not a criticism of pastors. This is not a criticism of seminaries. This is not a criticism of churches. It's kind of provocative questions. Do seminaries have the training for up and coming pastors to say, it's not up to me, it is up to me leading an organization that is multiplying, a culture that's multiplying, building disciples? I don't see it in the business schools. Chuck, is it out there in the seminaries? How are we building our people?
Yeah, I think it's probably better now than it has been in my 26 years of teaching. But to say it's better doesn't mean necessarily we are where we need to be. I think we have to recognize that we tend to be very cognitive oriented. We tend to want to make sure you get all the data down, and I'm not opposed to that. I think we've got to do that. This is our one opportunity to help these students be equipped the best we can equip them to do ministry out of our context. But I think we also are recognizing increasingly so that means we have to help students know how to feed on the word and help others feed on the word. When I went through seminary, we did not have a class on personal disciple making, on personal discipleship. Now, most of the seminaries with whom I work have some kind of course that at least gets it on the table. Now, given our conversation here, I think we have to all be aware that what we do as a seminary in one class is hardly going to fix this issue. But at least it's a starting point to say, let's at least get your feet on the ground and help you lead your church at least a little more in the direction that they need to be going in you becoming a multiplying disciple maker.
Why in the world did you write this, Chuck?
I wrote this because I think it's one thing to say we're not doing a good job discipling. We're just not doing what we need to do in making disciples. I think an awful lot of pastors would admit that. But I also think that if we're going to help address the issue, we do have to ask the question a little bit of how did we get here? What are some obstacles if we're really going to walk beside new believers and older believers who sometimes have never been discipled themselves and challenge them to begin growing? We probably need to recognize that this is not going to be easy to make this transition. And so if we at least recognize what some of these obstacles are, we aren't caught off guard by them when we're trying to fix something, and we don't give up as easily when we recognize, wow, I was told this might happen, and so here it is. Let's figure out how we work through it and work around it to continue the task.
Wow. So which one do you think is the biggest barrier? Which one do you think really needs to be grappled with fundamentally?
I think we have to recognize and admit that many of us who are leaders in the North American church by position quite often, I think we have to admit that many of us have never been strategically, intentionally discipled. Okay. And that many of us have had to figure out how to walk with Christ the hard way on our own, trying to pick ourselves up when we fall. And now what's happening is while we recognize we need to make disciples, we're equally trying to figure that out on the fly because we've never experienced it ourselves. Wow. And I think for many of us as leaders, we may have to come to the point to say, God, regardless of my position, I still need somebody to lock arms with me and walk with me and help me know how to continue to grow in Christ. So that not just so that, but so that I can turn around and give to others what you continue to teach me. I think it begins with us saying we need to continue to grow as disciples, which means we need to have others who are continuing to disciple us. Where that's become most helpful to me is You know the name Robert Coleman, who wrote the Master Plan of Evangelism? He looks at the way Jesus did evangelism, and that's calling out his disciples and investing in them. Dr. Coleman challenged me years ago to invest in other young students. And I've tried to do that. But I'm 62. I have a pastoral mentor who's in his late 70s. He has his own mentors who are in their 90s, and he meets with a mentor still once a week. So we've got a 90-year-old pouring into the 70-year-old who gives me time when I need someone to pray for me and talk to me that I can turn around and give to others. I think at the end of the day, we have to admit we all need that. And when we don't have that, we try to figure out how to make disciples on our own, and it seldom works.
Chuck, we absolutely need to know what caused all this stuff, because we need to gaslight these people and cancel them. So who caused this? Where's the problem, right?
Yeah, I think, and I can just speak for myself generationally. When I became a believer many years ago in the 70s now, we had moved discipleship into the image I use in my book Disciple is we have pieces of the puzzle. We have this program, we have this program, we have this program, we have this program, and that's not to say that any one of those programs is not helpful, whether it's Sunday school, small groups, life groups, training union, we called it in Southern Baptist Life, our worship service. All of those are helpful parts of the process of making disciples. But I think what we failed to do is put those puzzle pieces together in such a way that we're helping believers see this is what we want to help you do as you're growing in Christ. And here's why we're doing this, because Jesus mandated that we do this. Here's what we're aiming for, right. that you're carrying out the Great Commission, the Great Commandment, and here's our process for helping you get there. I just don't think that we put the puzzle pieces together. We expect believers to put the puzzle pieces together themselves. And that, again, that's just problematic.
Actually, we've talked to a number of young people and people engaged with Gen Z. When they read the book, they say, you guys have done a really terrific job of showing how your generation screwed up the world. We don't care. What do you want us to do? What should we be doing in a positive sense to make things better? So I'm going to throw that question at you. You give me 11 things we've done wrong that are failing. What do we need to do to move forward?
Yeah, to strengthen what we do in discipleship. My experience with the students I've worked with now for more than a quarter of a century, they do long for authenticity. They do long for genuine faith. They want to see it modeled. They want someone to walk beside them to get it done. And I think what we're going to have to do is not worry about getting the whole congregation on board, not worry about making sure that all of these people who are in our pews every Sunday are suddenly jumping on board with our strategy. I think we have to back up and look at the way Jesus did this, the way Paul did it. You find the few and you invest your life in them from day one, challenging them to turn around and invest their lives in others who may need to come and follow Christ, or they become believers and they need to grow. I think we need to go back to discipleship that is at three levels: corporate, in that we disciple from the preaching of the word; small group, in that we disciple in a more intimate connection place; but then we ultimately get back to I disciple 1, 2, 3 other young men.
Raymond, I'm beginning to feel like there are 11 theses being nailed on the door of Wittenberg here with the way he's setting this up. What do you think?
I really enjoyed what you just said, Chuck. It was really important. And at least in my world, there are a few places in the church where serious Christians have the opportunity to just ordinarily talk about their faith.
Yeah, no, that's right. All the while recognizing that, and some of this comes out of my experience in the seminary. I'm investing in students who are doing everything in their power to graduate and leave me, because that's what they want. I mean, that's the world I live in. And so what I have to do in my context is to figure out, how do I use the time that the Lord gives us together, knowing that this student is going to be launched. And so how do I at least get him closer to where he needs to be, knowing that he is going to graduate, ideally, at some point in his life.
Professor Chuck Lawless, as we wrap up on this, I wanted to ask you two questions. The first question is, as you look at the students that you're with today, what do you think the greatest challenges, one or two ideas, facing them as up and coming pastors heading out into the world? What do you think the big challenges are for them, if you were to cite one or two?
Yeah, I think in some ways the unique moral issues that we are facing today, that when I started pastoring 42 years ago, had you said we would face these kinds of things, the issues with the gender issues, some of the things that are, they're not entirely new, but they're certainly much more there in front of us in the lives even of people that we are trying to reach. I think those kinds of challenges are just going to continue to grow. And the questions that people are raising are questions that my generation never dreamed anyone would raise. And so I think that's going to be a challenge for pastors to address in the days to come. And that may be a primary one. I also think that it's quite possible that even in North American culture, it's going to become increasingly risky to stand up for Christ. I don't know when and how that will happen, but I do think it's going to be more and more costly to stand up for Jesus, and I think we have to be prepared for that.
As we get ready to wrap this up, Chuck, could you tell the folks who are watching, how can they find the work of Chuck Lawless and get the ebook Bubbles and get a copy of 11 Obstacles? Where would they go?
Yeah, my website is chucklawless.com, and I write a blog 3 days a week, and then I also write a devotion 5 days a week that really started in my trying to invest in some young men and hold myself accountable to them and seek their accountability to me in turn. And so it's been a good way for me to journal my devotions. That's at chucklawless.com. The bubble book, Lord, I'm Caught in the Bubble, is actually available at churchanswers.com. Church Answers with Tom Rainer. Church Answers is providing that book free.
Professor Chuck Lawless, on behalf of the Disciple Dilemma, thank you for your ministry. Thank you that you and Pam run the race well together in Christ. And thank you for all you're doing to help wake the world up on what's going on in discipleship. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. It's been good to be with you.
Raymond, thanks for leading us on this one today.
Oh, happy to do it. It's been fun. Chuck's been great.
Thanks for watching this episode. Discipleship Has Obstacles with Dr. Chuck Lawless. And folks, if this is your first time or your 50th time with us on the Disciple Dilemma, please help us get the word out. Discipleship in the Western Christian world has been hacked, and we want folks talking about that because it's not the biblical model Christ gave us. You can follow us, you can like us, and you can hit the subscribe button on all of the major social media platforms: YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Rumbly, and the RSS feed. Please help us get the word out. And as always, folks, thanks for listening.